I never thought a thunderstorm could change my life forever. But that night, as the storm raged outside, my stepson stood at the doorway with a look I couldn't understand or ignore. His hesitant words cut through the silence. And in his eyes, I saw something that made my heart race in a way I didn't expect. That moment, something shifted, and I realized things would never be the same again. Sarah's life had always been about routines and responsibilities. A devoted wife and stepmother, she had worked hard to build a semblance of normalcy in a household that wasn't always easy to manage. Christopher, her husband, was a dedicated man but distant, a trait Sarah had grown used to over the years. His demanding job meant long nights away, boardrooms replacing family dinners, and phone calls substituting for real conversations. Sarah told herself she was okay with it, that this was just how things were. Her stepson, Elias, had re-entered her life just months ago, returning home to attend college nearby. Elias had grown into a reserved yet striking young man, with an intensity about him that made people notice him even when he said little. There was something unpolished but endearing in the way he carried himself, so different from Christopher's calculated perfection. Sarah had welcomed Elias's presence, even if it stirred old insecurities. She wanted to be a good stepmother, a role she had taken seriously since marrying Christopher. Despite this, she couldn't shake the loneliness that had crept into her life like a shadow. It was the kind of isolation that no amount of busywork could cure. The house they lived in was grand, almost too grand. Its high ceilings and sprawling rooms often felt empty, amplifying the stillness when Christopher was away. The echoes of Sarah's footsteps through the hallways only reminded her of how hollow her life had become. But having Elias around added a warmth she hadn't realized she'd missed. He was attentive in a way his father never was, always noticing when she seemed tired or overwhelmed. The stormy night when Elias entered her room had left Sarah uneasy. It wasn't just the storm outside that had shaken her, it was the storm Elias brought with him. His presence lingered, filling the space with an energy she couldn't define but couldn't dismiss. She replayed the moment over and over, his voice, his concern, the unspoken weight in his gaze. And for the first time in years, Sarah felt truly seen. She told herself it was nothing, but deep down she knew better. Something was changing, and it scared her more than she was willing to admit. It started subtly, small, almost imperceptible shifts in the way things felt around the house. Elias's glances lingered a little longer than they should have. His presence, once reassuring, began to feel charged, as if an invisible current ran between them. Sarah tried to ignore it, dismissing her own unease as paranoia. After all, she was a married woman, and Elias was just her stepson. But the signs were hard to overlook. Elias began spending more time in the shared spaces of the house. He would show up in the kitchen while she was cooking, offering to help with the smallest tasks. In the evenings, he'd linger in the living room, casually starting conversations that always seemed to last longer than expected. At first, Sarah chalked it up to his need for connection. After all, college life could be isolating, and Christopher was rarely home. Yet, there was a heaviness in the air between them, one that grew harder to ignore. One evening, Sarah was folding laundry in the guest bedroom when she heard a faint knock on the door. She looked up to see Elias standing there, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice low and steady. There was nothing overtly wrong with his question, but something about the way he asked it made her stomach tighten. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, her voice sharper than intended. Elias didn't move, though, and for a moment they just looked at each other. It wasn't like the fleeting glances they'd shared before. This was heavy, almost suffocating. Finally, Elias nodded and turned away, leaving Sarah alone with the pounding of her heart. Christopher's frequent absences didn't help matters. He had always been dedicated to his work, but lately, his phone calls felt shorter, his tone more detached. Sarah tried to tell herself this was normal, that all marriages had ebbs and flows, but she couldn't shake the growing void between them. It was as if Christopher's absence created a vacuum, one that Elias's presence was all too eager to fill. The moments of tension between Sarah and Elias became more frequent. A casual brush of hands while reaching for the same plate, an offhand compliment about how she looked that lingered too long in the air. Each interaction added to the mounting pressure. Sarah felt trapped, caught between the roles she was supposed to play and the emotions she couldn't control. She began second-guessing herself, wondering if she was imagining things. But deep down, she knew the truth. One night, Sarah sat alone in the living room, the soft glow of a table lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The sound of Elias's footsteps on the stairs made her stiffen. He appeared in the doorway, his gaze soft but steady. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "Is everything okay?" Sarah's breath caught. The concern in his tone was genuine, but there was something else there, something unspoken. "I'm fine," she said, forcing a smile. But even as the words left her lips, she knew they were a lie. Elias stepped into the room, his movements slow, deliberate. "You don't seem fine," he said softly. "You seem different." Sarah's heart pounded as he crossed the room and sank into the chair opposite her. She opened her mouth to respond, to deflect, but no words came. The air between them felt heavy, charged with an electricity she couldn't explain. In that moment, Sarah realized she wasn't imagining it. Whatever was happening between them, it was real. And it was dangerous. The days that followed were a blur of tension and confusion. Sarah tried to go about her routine as if nothing had changed, but everything felt different. The way Elias looked at her, the subtle shifts in his tone when he spoke to her, and even the silence between them, it all felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. One afternoon, Sarah stood in the kitchen, slicing vegetables for dinner. The rhythmic chop of the knife was oddly soothing, a brief distraction from the turmoil inside her. She didn't hear Elias enter until his voice startled her. "Need some help?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with something she couldn't quite place. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, catching the hint of a smile on his lips. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she resumed chopping. Elias didn't leave. Instead, he moved closer, his presence filling the room. "You've been distant lately," he said after a moment. "Did I do something wrong?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She set the knife down and turned to face him, forcing herself to meet his gaze. His expression was open, vulnerable in a way that made her chest tighten. "No, of course not," she replied quickly. "I've just had a lot on my mind." Elias nodded but didn't look convinced. "You can talk to me, you know," he said softly. "I'm here if you need anything." The sincerity in his voice was disarming, and for a moment, Sarah felt the urge to open up to him. But she caught herself, shaking her head as if to dispel the thought. "Thank you, Elias," she said, her tone final. "But I'm fine." As she turned back to the cutting board, she felt him step closer. The air between them seemed to thicken, and Sarah's breath hitched as she became acutely aware of how close he was standing. His voice, low and almost hesitant, broke the silence. "You don't have to keep everything to yourself," he said. "I know how lonely it can get." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the warmth of his presence, the subtle tension that seemed to draw them closer together. When she turned to face him again, her eyes met his, and for a moment neither of them spoke. It was Elias who broke the silence. "I care about you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "More than I probably should." The confession sent a jolt through Sarah, and she stepped back instinctively, her hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. "Elias, you can't say things like that," she said, her voice trembling. "I know," he replied, his expression pained. "But I can't help how I feel." Sarah shook her head, trying to find the right words to defuse the situation, but nothing came. The space between them felt impossibly small, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a physical force. The sound of the front door opening broke the moment, and Sarah exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Christopher's voice called out from the hallway, and Sarah quickly turned back to the counter, her hands busying themselves with the vegetables. Elias stepped back, his expression unreadable as he left the kitchen without another word. That night, Sarah lay awake in bed, her thoughts racing. She replayed the conversation over and over, analyzing every word, every look, every subtle shift in Elias's tone. She told herself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a passing moment of vulnerability. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The following evening, as the house settled into its usual quiet rhythm, Elias found her in the living room. He sat down on the sofa beside her, his presence immediately filling the space. Sarah tensed but didn't move, her eyes fixed on the book in her lap. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "I didn't mean to." Sarah looked at him then, her heart aching at the sincerity in his expression. "It's okay," she said softly. "I understand." But did she? She wasn't sure anymore. All she knew was that Elias's presence was stirring something in her she hadn't felt in years. Something she wasn't ready to confront. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between them only grew. Every glance, every accidental touch, Every unspoken word added to the weight of what was happening. Sarah found herself both drawn to Elias and desperate to keep her distance, caught in a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't control. And Elias? He didn't back down. His quiet persistence, his unspoken feelings, and the way he looked at her. All of it created a storm that Sarah knew she couldn't outrun. Whatever was happening between them, it was only a matter of time before it came to a head. The storm outside mirrored the one brewing within Sarah as she sat alone in the living room, staring blankly at the flickering light of the candle on the coffee table. The power had gone out hours ago, leaving the house cloaked in darkness save for the faint amber glow. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant rumble of thunder. Sarah's thoughts were anything but quiet, a tangled web of confusion and guilt that refused to let her rest. She hadn't seen Elias all evening, and part of her was relieved. His absence gave her space to breathe, to think, to regain some semblance of control over the emotions that had been spiraling out of control. Yet she couldn't deny the part of her that missed him, that longed for the sound of his voice or the warmth of his gaze. The thought made her stomach twist with shame. A soft knock at the door startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. Her heart raced as she turned to see Elias standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the faint glow of the flashlight he held. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made Sarah's breath catch. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I just wanted to check if you were okay." Sarah swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the edge of the sofa cushion. "I'm fine," she replied, though the shakiness in her voice betrayed her. "Just waiting for the power to come back on." Elias stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. He set the flashlight on the table, its beam casting a soft, diffused light that mingled with the candle's glow. "It's so quiet," he said, sinking into the armchair across from her. "I guess I'm not used to it." Sarah forced a smile, though her heart was pounding. "It's peaceful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "At least it should be." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken tension. Sarah could feel Elias's gaze on her, and it took all her strength to keep her eyes fixed on the candle's flame. When he finally spoke again, his words were soft but firm. "Sarah, we need to talk." Her breath caught at the sound of her name. He rarely called her that, always Lila or Mom, though the latter had never quite felt natural. She looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his, and the intensity in his gaze made her chest tighten. "There's nothing to talk about," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "This is just a misunderstanding." Elias shook his head, his expression pained. "It's not a misunderstanding. You know it isn't." Sarah's hands trembled as she set them in her lap, her fingers twisting nervously. "Elias, whatever this is, it has to stop. It's not right." "I know it's not," he replied, his voice low, almost pleading. "But that doesn't change how I feel." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Sarah felt her resolve faltering, the walls she had built around herself crumbling under the weight of his honesty. She wanted to tell him to leave, to create the distance she so desperately needed, but the words wouldn't come. "You're young," she said finally, her voice barely steady. "This is just a phase. You'll move on." Elias leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he looked at her with an intensity that made her heart ache. "Don't do that," he said softly. "Don't dismiss this like it doesn't matter. Because it does. You matter." The raw emotion in his voice was almost too much to bear. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice breaking. "It's about you. And Christopher. And this family." "Christopher doesn't see you," Elias said, his tone bitter. "Not the way I do." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, all she could do was stare at him, her chest heaving with the effort of holding back the sobs that threatened to escape. "That doesn't matter," she said finally, her voice trembling. "He's my husband, and you're my stepson." Elias stood then, his movements sudden and full of energy, as if he couldn't bear to sit still any longer. He paced the room, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I know how it sounds," he said, his voice rising slightly. "But I can't ignore this anymore. I can't pretend like nothing's changed." Sarah stood too, her legs shaky beneath her as she moved toward the window. She stared out at the storm-darkened night, her reflection faint in the glass. "You have to," she said, her voice firm despite the tears streaming down her face. "You have to ignore it. Because if you don't, this will destroy everything." Elias turned to face her, his eyes blazing with emotion. It's already destroyed me, he said, his voice breaking. Every time I see you, every time I think about you, it tears me apart. But I can't stop. Sarah turned to him then, her own anger rising to meet his. You think this is easy for me, she said, her voice sharp. You think I don't feel the same? But I'm the adult here, Elias. I have to make the right choice, even if it kills me. The confession hung in the air between them, a bombshell neither of them could take back. For a moment they just stared at each other, their breathing heavy, the silence filled with everything they couldn't say. Finally, Elias took a step back, his expression crumbling into one of defeat. I'm sorry, he said softly, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to make things harder for you. Sarah closed her eyes, her tears falling freely now. It's too late for that, she said, her voice breaking. Without another word, Elias turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Sarah sank to her knees, her body shaking with silent sobs as the storm raged on outside. She knew this wasn't the end, not by a long shot. But for now it was all she could do to hold herself together. The house felt heavier in the days that followed, weighed down by the aftermath of that night. Elias had withdrawn, his presence a shadow of what it had been. He no longer lingered in the shared spaces, or found excuses to be near Sarah. He barely spoke at all, and when he did, his words were clipped, his tone distant. The tension between them was unbearable, but Sarah knew it was necessary. She had drawn a line, and now they both had to live with it. Christopher returned home a few days later, oblivious to the storm that had brewed in his absence. He greeted Sarah with a kiss on the cheek, his mind already preoccupied with his next trip, his next meeting. The familiarity of his routine felt hollow now, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling inside her. She wanted to tell him everything, to lay it all out and beg him to fix what had been broken. But how could she? This wasn't something Christopher could fix. Elias avoided Christopher, too. He stayed locked in his room most of the time, emerging only for meals, and even then, his interactions were brief and forced. Christopher didn't seem to notice the change in his son's behavior, chalking it up to the stress of college. Sarah envied his ignorance. It was easier not to see, easier to pretend everything was fine. One evening, as Sarah was folding laundry in the quiet of the guest room, she heard a soft knock at the door. Her heart sank as she turned to see Elias standing there, his expression unreadable. She braced herself for what he might say, but instead, he simply stepped inside and leaned against the doorframe. I'm leaving, he said, his voice flat. Sarah froze, the neatly folded towel slipping from her hands. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. I mean I'm moving out, Elias replied. I've been looking at apartments near campus. It's time. Her chest tightened, panic rising within her. Elias, you don't have to do this. You don't have to go. Yes, I do, he said firmly. Staying here isn't good for me. Or for you. The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. She knew he was right, but the thought of him leaving filled her with a sense of loss she couldn't explain. Does Christopher know? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias nodded. I told him I needed my own space. He was fine with it. Sarah's heart ached at the finality in his tone. She wanted to say something, anything, to make him stay, but she knew she couldn't. This was the only way. When are you leaving? She asked, her voice breaking. Tomorrow, Elias said. I've already packed most of my things. The room fell silent, the air between them heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, Elias stepped forward, his movements hesitant. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said softly. I never wanted this to happen. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes as she looked up at him. I didn't either, she said, her voice trembling. But it did. For a moment, they just stood there, the distance between them feeling both too much and not enough. Then Elias reached out, his hand brushing against hers in a gesture so fleeting it was almost imperceptible. Take care of yourself, he said, his voice barely audible. And be happy. Before she could respond, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Sarah alone with the crushing weight of her emotions. She sank to the bed, her tears falling freely now. She had done the right thing, she told herself. She had made the only choice she could. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a loss. The next morning, Sarah watched from the window as Elias loaded the last of his boxes into his car. He didn't look back as he drove away, and Sarah felt a piece of her heart go with him. The house felt emptier than it ever had, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost something important, something she would never get back. Christopher didn't seem to notice the change in Sarah. He went about his routine as usual, his life a constant cycle of work and travel. Sarah threw herself into keeping the house in order, hoping the monotony would numb the ache inside her. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the memories of Elias, his voice, his presence, the unspoken connection they had shared. Days turned into weeks, and the emptiness in the house became a part of her routine. But the guilt never faded. She replayed every moment in her mind, wondering if she could have done something differently, if she could have prevented things from spiraling out of control. She hated herself for the part of her that missed him, that longed for the attention and understanding he had given her. One night, as she lay awake in the dark, Sarah thought about the choices she had made and the consequences she was now living with. She had done what she thought was right, but at what cost? She had lost Elias, and in some ways she felt she had lost herself. Weeks turned into months, and the house settled into an uneasy rhythm of normalcy. Elias was gone and life moved forward as it always did. Christopher remained oblivious to the storm that had passed, his attention focused on work. To him, Elias's move was just a natural part of growing up, nothing more. But for Sarah, every quiet moment in the house felt like a reminder of what had happened, of the choices she had made and the lines they had come so dangerously close to crossing. She kept herself busy, throwing herself into hobbies she had neglected over the years, gardening, painting, even volunteering at the local community center. But no matter how much she tried to distract herself, her thoughts always found their way back to Elias. She wondered how he was doing, whether he had settled into his new place, whether he was happy. She thought about texting him, even drafting messages late at night, but she never sent them. It wasn't her place anymore. One afternoon, as Sarah stood in the garden pruning roses, Christopher approached her. He looked tired, his shirt wrinkled from a long day of meetings, but his expression was softer than usual. "You've been quiet lately," he said, leaning against the garden fence. "Is everything okay?" Sarah hesitated, her hands stilling as she considered how to respond. Part of her wanted to tell him everything, to unload the weight she had been carrying for so long. But she couldn't. It wasn't just her secret to share, and the damage it would cause wasn't something she was willing to risk. "I'm fine," she said finally, forcing a smile. "Just adjusting. The house feels a little emptier without Elias." Christopher nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, it does. I miss him too." The simplicity of his words, the genuine sadness in his tone, made Sarah's chest tighten. It was the first time in a long while that she had felt a connection to Christopher, however fleeting. She reached out and touched his arm, her voice softer now. "We'll be okay," she said, more for herself than for him. In the quiet that followed, Sarah realized something important. While the past couldn't be changed, it didn't have to define her future. She had made mistakes, let herself be swept up in emotions she hadn't fully understood, but she still had a chance to make things right. Not by erasing what had happened, but by choosing to grow from it. Over time, Sarah began to find her footing again. She focused on rebuilding her relationship with Christopher, taking small but meaningful steps to bridge the distance that had grown between them. She encouraged him to take breaks from work, to spend more time together as a family. Slowly but surely, they found moments of connection, reminders of the love that had brought them together in the first place. And though Sarah still thought of Elias from time to time, the ache in her chest began to dull. She found solace in the knowledge that he was carving out his own path, one that didn't depend on her. She hoped he was finding his own sense of peace, just as she was learning to find hers. One evening, as Sarah sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Elias. It was brief, just a simple, "Hope you're doing well." But it brought a smile to her face, a small reminder that while things between them could never be the same, they could still exist in each other's lives in some small way. As the days turned into years, Sarah carried the lessons of that stormy night with her. She learned to set boundaries, to confront her own loneliness rather than letting it consume her, and to cherish the relationships that truly mattered. It wasn't an easy road, but it was a necessary one. And in the end, Sarah found herself stronger, more grounded, and more at peace than she had been in a long time. If you were in Sarah's position, what would you have done? Could you have made the same choices, or would you have followed a different path? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more heart-stopping stories like this one. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. A tale so twisted it will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love and loyalty.